and I'm currently serving on the steering committee for Quaker Earth Care Witness, as well as on the advisory board for another religious climate organization, which is a climate justice program from Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon. And I get a lot of other hats in a lot of other places. So what I'm going to do is instead, Carolyn, you're right next to me. So why don't you chime in?
Hey, so I did put in the chat, I'm the Education and Curriculum Manager for the CLEO Institute. We are a climate education and advocacy organization focusing a great deal on climate justice throughout the state of Florida. I'm in the Tallahassee office. And as it's relevant to this conversation, I'm also an adjunct professor at Tallahassee Community College, teaching biology and earth science and sort of sneaking in climate education as much as I can. I think that's about it for me. Katie, you want to go ahead? Oh,
sure.
Didn't specify which one, but it's you.
Me. Okay. Hey, everyone. I'm Katie Wolfson, she, her. I am at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado. So I am the School and Public Programs Manager at the UCAR Center for Science Education, which is one of our education groups there. So my team oversees and maintains the exhibits in like a small science center that we have at our visitor center at NCAR. We also provide field trips, K through 12, private tours for anywhere. We joke from pre-K to gray, of preschoolers all the way through seniors. We also have politicians and policymakers come through for tours or special talks with the NCAR scientists and groups there and labs. So really wide audience. And so we're delivering those programs at the Mesa Lab as well as virtual. We have a virtual studio that we do international outreach as well. So kind of focused on kind of Earth system science education and outreach, and kind of sharing out the science and the work being done at NCAR, which, you know, involves climate. So we have a whole climate exhibit floor. And so I maintain a small team to deliver those programs. And I will popcorn to, let's see if someone's not on camera. Get Katie, the other Katie.
Yeah, Katie's Unite. Hi everyone, I'm Katie Boyd. I am the Clean Program Manager, and otherwise we're based at the NOAA's Cooperative Institute for Research and Environmental Sciences, which is housed at the University of Colorado in the Boulder area, the traditional lands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute. And I spend most of my time managing Clean, and then I also do other work doing evaluation and research on some of our other educational programs that we do at Ceres Education and Outreach as well. So yeah, and I use she, her pronouns, and it's nice to see everyone today. And sorry, I'm going to keep my camera off for today, but I think Gina, are you the last one?
I think indeed I am. Thank you. I'm Gina Fiorelli Duranlo. I am the Clean Program Coordinator, so I work with Katie Boyd. And I actually work remotely from Vermont, even though Clean and Ceres is based out of CU Boulder, like Katie said. So yeah, I help coordinate all these calls and have great facilitators like Eric and Carolyn and other folks bring topics and presenters, and I do appreciate everyone joining today.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for the intros. And I'm located in on originally the Ohlone lands in Oakland, California. Have done climate change education, environmental literacy for the past 30 years or so. I work with teachers and with students. So Lynn, excited to hear about some of your professional development programs, and Katie, great to hear about the UCAR work too. So today we were sort of proposing, but we don't have to, you know, depending on where folks want to guide the discussion, it's informal today. But Frank and I connected this morning about the idea of the UN annual COP conferences and just how we might look at ways to make them more accessible to sort of the global community. And Frank's been working on developing a tool and has, and I'll let Frank, you speak to your background more extensively, but has been to a number of in-person conferences over the years, the UN conferences in different parts of the world, and attended virtually in the status that we call observer. So we're going to start there. We thought we'd start there with, and if that's of interest, to kind of discuss that idea of either interest in COP, attending, participating, questions about it. Specifically, I know I've never personally been, but I'm very interested to go one day. But my intention this year is to attend virtually. It's taking place in Dubai this year. And then the following year, it'll be in Australia. And my goal is to personally attend that in person if possible. So kind of have some goals in mind, and just some larger logistical, or sort of over the course of between now and the fall conference, there'll be some touch points in the clean calls on COP specifically, a number. So kind of building understanding and of what it is and how it's structured, how to participate. So that's kind of some context too. This is sort of we had proposed with Gina and Katie that maybe we could revisit this, quarterly, just to kind of keep it top of mind. But anyway, I'll stop there, and maybe Frank, if you wanted to add anything, or the tool that you've been working on and some of the projects we've been working on together. Oh, I think you're on mute there.
Okay, so let's try that again. So what I want to do here, add in a couple of dates for folks to keep in mind. And then, as Eric said, I'm going to talk a little bit about some projects that he and I are involved with, as well as some bigger conversations. And I'm trying to do this real quick, so bear with me. First thing, before we get rolling, as Eric mentioned, COP28 is in Dubai this year, UAE. And one of the charming things about this, much more so than most COPs, is that it is the COP presidency is the UAE's energy minister, who also happens to be a fossil fuel company executive. So much more so than most times, the idea of trying to get more grassroots voices on this table is critical, because it's the process is very much in danger of getting shanghaied, particularly with this presidency. That being said, a couple of clean events coming up. Sadi Citron, who is with Citizens Climate. Gina, if I'm getting these dates wrong or I'm speaking out of turn, let me know. But Sadi's will be talking about connecting at COP28, connecting to COP28 through the People's Pavilion. And Citizens Climate is kind of unique in a lot of these remote engagement activities or efforts, in that it is actually working with the UNFCCC, with the Secretariat. Most times, a lot of remote engagement activities or efforts are done independent of the UN. And then I've got down here on the calendar, 7/18, Haley Campbell's going to be, who is with she's the co-executive director of Care About Climate. I met them last year through a wonderful webinar that they're doing that was called Care About COP webinar series. And they do a section called COP at Home. And they're rolling out their new series in August, and they're on the 18th of July, they're slated to actually talk with us. In terms of the two projects that Eric and I are involved with, here in Portland, as I said, I'm a PSU instructor. And so I'm working with my university to get the university to step up to the plate to being an anchor for a Portland hub for remote engagement with COP28. And just had finished a workshop with that a little while ago. So Eric and I are talking about the idea of a Bay Area hub that would use science museums as the anchor point. One of the things that's important about the Bay Area hub is AGU this year is back in San Francisco. There's a 2-day overlap between COP28 and the fall meeting. And I've already had an opportunity to talk with a couple of AGU staffers about how to utilize that overlap. And I did mention to them that Eric and I were talking about Bay Area hub activities, and they are quite interested in possibly partnering. So those are a couple of things on the docket. Number of other conversations that have been having here. Not gonna regale you with those. I'm kind of hoping that there would be some other folks on this call like Jen and Kristen who have also been to the COPs, because I think one of the things that we talk about when I think about clean in relation to COPs and COP engagement, I'm thinking the people that we have as part of the network who have been to the COPs, being able to put together our experience, document our experience somehow about what being an observer is about, why it's important, and then how we can go about actually connecting up the rest of the world to essentially build what you call a global blue-green zone. And one last comment I'll add to this is the idea of getting people in different parts of the globe connected with the UN process, besides the importance that I talked about at the very beginning. It's not a case of reinventing the wheel. It's a case of pulling together the threads of what people have been doing. And there have been, particularly during COP26, there were an enormous amount of activities that were going on in the UK and other parts of the world that didn't get much airtime. And that being said, there's an awful lot of building to do to really get the kind of grassroots representation at the UN table that needs to be done. So anyway, with that, that's an awful lot to chew on.
And maybe just a quick show of hands, or maybe 1, 2, or 3, familiar with COP, pretty comfortable with what it is and really understand what it is. So maybe just maybe a visual show of hands, or Katie. Great. So Lynn, a 3, and Katie kind of in the middle, Gina kind of in the middle, Frank a 3. I'm probably like a 1.5 to 2, Katie Boyd. So we have a fair amount of kind of COP literacy in the group. I think one of the things Frank and I were talking about too was just expanding on what Frank had mentioned, how to make it more accessible to more folks, and a digital kind of virtual access points is a great way to go. We've talked in clean calls in the past about some of the systems and structures in place at the UN make it, some of their tech is kind of a little archaic, and 2, the way the UN is structured specifically maybe doesn't lend itself to equity and accessibility, with the idea that the global South is really not represented in the same way that the North is in terms of decision making. So some larger structures that make it sort of challenging out the gate, but at the same time, some of the new tools and abilities that we have, and as Frank said, a lot of efforts to this effect of trying to raise awareness and visibility. I mean, and I guess my anecdotal piece would be, I tend to watch PBS News here in the Bay Area, and they're always covering something related to climate, and it's almost like I wouldn't say nightly, but I'd say a couple days a week, there's something connected to climate. But then you look at the standard news offerings and, you know, virtually nothing, right? And when the conference comes around, you know, maybe you'll hear something in the news about it. So it's this idea that how does this huge convening that happens annually on this large scale topic that we're all deeply concerned about, how does it permeate our culture in a different way? The last thing I would say is, you know, some of the knocks on when it happens, and I'm thinking about my own family who tends to skew a different direction from me in terms of climate literacy and understanding and sort of concern, is, oh, is everybody jetting over to the COP conference and using all those carbon emissions? You know, so it's sort of like this attack on the process, which at one sense, you know, okay, that's you can talk about that, and we each have our own carbon footprints, but in my mind, what happens at that conference is so important, and it's an opportunity to convene folks in a way that some large scale actions can happen. But then this idea of the digital entry points and virtual entry points expand that access exponentially and in a lower carbon footprint sort of model. So I think there's so many different arguments to and ideas to bring this kind of sensibility and these kind of tools into the mix. But yeah, for those of you, like, you know, other thoughts about COP, your interest in it, some of the things we're bringing up.
I just shared a link in the chat box. This is the Climate Justice Pavilion website that I use to keep myself up to date about what was going on, sponsored by WEAC and some other environmental justice organizations from the States. And they pretty much had 24-hour access to what was going on. And so it was a great way to kind of stay connected.
Thanks so much for sharing this, Lynn. This is awesome. Was Deb Morrison involved in this pavilion as well? Is this the one that?
I'm not sure. I'm familiar with Peggy Shepard, and she's the head of WEAC, and Dr. Mildred McLean out of Savannah, Georgia, and some others. Dr. Bullard. I'm not particularly familiar with the person you mentioned, but I'm really bad at names. And so sometimes I have to see a face to remind me.
Sure, because I know she was, and I think potentially Haley Campbell and Haley Krim too were involved in an environmental justice space. And maybe my understanding, and folks jump in, but the way, and you know, there are these pavilions. Well, there's the blue and green zones, which have different levels of access, sort of for the public visitor, sort of the every person involvement. And then there's a zone that's sort of explicitly for the diplomats and is a bit more restricted. So there's that side of the structure of COP. And then there's sort of thematic pavilions. So this idea of an environmental justice pavilion, and that idea being centered, and a fairly new occurrence, Lynn, is my understanding that was a new concept. And one of the ones that I got involved in virtually last year was, and we'll revisit this, actually another date is June 6th. We're going to revisit this idea, but there was last year's conference was in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, which is in the climate zone we call the Mediterranean climate zone, of which there are 5 like that around the world, where you get sort of wet periods, wet dry periods, or warm wet periods, and warm dry periods, cool wet winters. And there was a pavilion that was started by a UN secretary, Graminos Mastrojani, around the idea of unifying the Mediterranean region. So it was a Mediterranean pavilion, and that was a first that was offered this year. And the intention is to sort of extend that next year, but the idea of bringing a region together, you know, in the same way that we're sort of, Frank and I are working on this project to have regional hubs raising awareness and accessibility to COP. The idea was to unite similar climate zones who are dealing with similar climate challenges, you know, the idea of water scarcity, droughts, heat waves, things that you hear about, you know, in California news all the time are replicated across in the Mediterranean basin, in the global south. There's 3 zones. So at any rate, the idea of these pavilions offering, you know, collaborative opportunities to bring folks together with similar interests, similar backgrounds, and then how to kind of back to our kind of theme for today, how do you amplify that through virtual and digital entry points? So you could imagine, you know, if you've been to any of the in-person or virtual sessions at COP that they've made available more prevalently this last few years, you've got a panel and you've got folks there that attend at the conference, but then the power of bringing in expertise from around the world digitally and virtually to those conversations could make for a much more robust collaborative opportunity. And then the output, you know, these global connections that can be made, I think these types of platforms can facilitate that. So that's at the conference itself, but then kind of this idea of also preparing folks in advance. I think that's the power of the platform, I think, Frank, that you're working on, and the idea of regionally sort of clustering ourselves and sort of organizing and preparing. You know, it's kind of like the best term paper is the one that you've written over weeks, not the one you do the night before. If you know, get together, prepare, find opportunities to collaborate and get involved, even if you're not intending to go, the output's probably going to be much more robust. And maybe the long-term relationship, the idea that COP conference is just a signature event once a year, but it's really an ongoing effort, as we know. So I mean, just piggybacking, Lynn, on what you shared about the Environmental Justice Pavilion, other areas of interest or that you're familiar with in terms of pavilions or UN efforts that you know you might, I guess, have interest in?
One thing to note about that Environmental Justice Pavilion, they intentionally use climate justice instead of environmental justice as a way to help people kind of transition to see that environmental justice organizations do work on climate justice issues. And so if you look on their website, they were very intentional about some of the language that they used. And so just keep that in mind too. Yeah.
Great.
So I want to just interject here. One thing I just put into the link, and I want to make sure it happened because I've never done it before. I put in into the chat an attachment, which is a PDF. Did that come through? Okay, good. That is a brief that I use for groups that I send to groups that I am hoping to encourage to organize local hubs or somehow be involved as a partner in organizing a local hub. And there is a link on the second page of that that takes you over to a Prezi on building a global blue-green zone. This is kind of my dog and pony show that I take around to a lot of different organizations to introduce the concept of hubs and look at some of the different ways that those hubs can form. And so that's a Prezi presentation. There are links there to all sorts of different efforts. Some efforts we've done here in the Portland area in the past, some efforts that have been done in the UK. It doesn't really I mean, it's the tip of the iceberg in terms of what people have been doing. Yeah. And Katie, you being from UCAR and from the Katie Wolfson, you're being from UCAR, I definitely would like to chat with you at some point because, as I said, Eric and I are trying to get a hub going in the Bay Area with some of the science museums, and it strikes me that there's a number of different focal points, if you will, Denver being one, Cornell being the other with PRI, and Don being involved with this. Plus, there's I know there's been Aztec conversations around that in Aztec about getting folks engaged. Science museums, public science centers make a really logical anchor point for a hub. And Lynn, I'm going to have to look up more about the pavilion you're talking about.
While you were talking, I was trying to type in the chat box. I was saying that I was briefly reading through your document, and I think that's definitely something that we would be interested in working with you on here in Baltimore. We're working with a few neighborhood associations around climate change resident engagement and having discussions and conversations around that. And we would love to work with some of those neighborhood associations and with our National Great Blacks in Wax Museum to see if they would consider being a hub as well.
That'd be a great conversation to have, particularly your involvement with religious groups, because that's been another group that have been really reaching out to. And there's some really good sort of international anchors out there, if you will, one of which is Interfaith Power and Light and Green Faith, both of whom tend to send people to the COPs.
Yes.
And we're kind of thinking, creating these models, right? Create a couple of conversations, start this in the Bay Area, like Frank was mentioning, bringing together. There's 4 or 5 pretty large scale science museums in the Bay Area, a couple in San Francisco, one here in the East Bay that I work with, Chabot Space and Science Center, the Tech Museum in the South Bay. And just many of the organizations are doing a lot of climate work in different ways. So, and they're public spaces. So they provide a really nice access point for folks. So if that's, it serves as a good model, but in the Baltimore area, Lynn, if it was, a nexus of faith-based organizations, or and if we think about Baltimore, and even in the DC, what kind of regional scope you might be interested in sort of grappling with, if we kind of go out past Baltimore into the DC area, for example, that's huge, and there's a lot going on. So yeah, I think trying these models out and maybe sharing back some of what we learn, and then allowing others to sort of do the same and offer their own spins on that.
Yeah, I love that idea of kind of that hub of museums and different organizations. And I'm curious, Eric and Frank, since y'all have been talking about doing that for Bay Area, like, what do you have a vision yet for, like, what that actually looks like? Is it talks? Is it engaging with the content coming out of COP in some way? Is it having forums or community talks? Or I'm just kind of curious if you had a vision for what that means to be a hub.
Let me give you 2 examples of that. 2019, my wife and I didn't go to COP25. Instead, I was working with a group of educators here in the Portland area to convene 2 different gatherings, public gatherings. One was at OMSI, which is local science museum. The other one was at Lewis and Clark. And this was a case of, to me, this would be kind of the optimal vision, if you will, particularly if it was expanded. In those particular instances, we had some panel discussions involving people who were locally active in climate issues. There was tabling, of course. There was also a what's called a Talanoa dialogue. One of the organizers was particularly keen on that negotiating process that emerged during COP23. And then we had there were anchor folks, if you will, in Madrid who were communicating to us in real time, which was no mean trick given the time zone difference. They were quite cordial about that. So that's one possibility out there. I mentioned that COP26 came with a lot of pretty exceptional activity. Of all the COPs that I've been to, that's the one that I really turn to in terms of people connecting remotely in meaningful ways. And there were two, in that particular case, there were two really noteworthy efforts. One is that Climate Reality Scotland partnered with the Scottish government to form watch parties, if you will, that were in remote communities in the north of Scotland. And so that was one part. And then the other part was Stop Climate Chaos Scotland, or UK, had what they called the Climate Fringe, which was a series of off-campus, in other words, off the UN campus, events, live events that were happening in Edinburgh as well as in Glasgow. And so there's quite a number of possibilities in those directions. One of the things I want to emphasize, particularly since we're sort of easing up on the COVID restriction routine, when you talk about being a virtual observer, like I was last for COP27, that was a case of sitting behind in my garage here and getting witnessing real time a lot of the events that were happening in Egypt. That's not an optimal way to participate. What to me is an optimal way to participate are gatherings that are virtually connected with each other. There's a lot of really excellent models out there. And that's what I think where science museums and universities and other in community institutions having strong IT infrastructure really come into play, because they can really enable that.
And I think piggybacking on Lynn or Katie, your question, and Frank, your thoughts, is this idea of contextualizing COP in a way. So as a kind of the classic local to global kind of perspective. So, at these hubs, I think maybe there's a standalone just conversation that Frank and I are kind of working on, like bringing museums together as conveners, as hubs for, involvement in COP. But there's also, I do a lot of work with Bay Area educators, both and students, and do direct programs with students, professional development workshops for teachers, and the idea of connecting those teachers and students to a global community, and kind of this idea that there's something happening in this international space. It can be very empowering to sort of understand what's happening across the globe, not only from the standpoint of COP and the decisions that are made, but from the communities that are represented around the globe, and the idea of climate justice, kind of piggybacking, Lynn, on what you shared. There's so much great work happening across the world, and I think what's emerging through environmental justice and climate justice is this idea that we need to pay attention to equity across the globe, and that there's so many. There's the differential impacts of climate change happening on communities of color, the global South carrying a lot of the burden of the impacts, but not being the ones that are driving the causes of climate change. But so many great solutions that are available and happening within these different cultures across the globe. So to me, that's tremendously empowering to sort of understand that, some of the stories that are happening, for example, in Australia with the Aboriginal population and the indigenous the indigenous kind of story is very similar to the Native American story here in the North America and South America. And there's some wisdom that I think is coming from those communities, that when you kind of connect the dots and see there's just something really empowering about that. So setting up a platform for that, I guess. And I'm kind of thinking, Katie, about your question too, like, what does it look like? So I think initially it's the first conversation is just to bring the museums together and have a dialogue, but how that plays out within the museums, we'll have to have a context for the museum, right? It's got to kind of resonate with where the museum's going, what they're doing, who their audiences are. So I think the initial step is this conversation, who do we want to bring together, but then how that would roll out within an institution. Would they embed it into a PD program? Would it be a public facing program? Would it be, just the logistics of setting up a virtual hub during the conference? Like, could the Exploratorium here in the Bay Area provide that physical space or that virtual space to do that? So I think it starts with a conversation, and then it's hopefully it's organic, and it's group decision making to figure out what it would look like within the context of a museum, for example.
Yes.
Other thoughts? And I know, Carolyn, you've shared a lot about the challenges of a state like Florida, for example, and not necessarily having, as many organizations kind of in the same geographic space. Kind of, do you see connecting points, or, just your thoughts from Florida?
So I mean, on these calls, I don't see as many folks. I will say I'm pretty plugged in to sort of the local. I wish there was more overlap, but I'm very involved in local activism, civic engagement, and environmental stuff. So thankfully, there are a lot of people working on it. It's just that everyone is up against the same institutional struggles. And I don't necessarily know that anyone, because I do a lot of work with like my local Planned Parenthood Health Center, focusing on access to healthcare, environmental protection. I'm a huge advocate with anyone locally who's working on like pedestrian friendly cities, but every single one of us is just banging our head against the wall. So like, there's honestly a lot of civic engagement and activism. I also live in the state capital, so it might be less in other areas, but yeah, I talk to a lot of folks who are very passionate, very activated, very out in the community. And we're all just collectively crashing into the immovable object, So that's really the big issue that I'm seeing around that is, there's just so much inertia. And I would say, honestly, that's probably also the case in a lot of some of these underserved communities. And, obviously it's much worse in places where, where people are so much more impacted, but yeah, I'm sorry. I do not know. I don't know the solution, because none of our strategies have really done much of anything. It's just been getting worse.
I know the silver lining,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no,
not like a hopeful, empowering kind of perspective. This last legislative session has left me so drained and defeated. Like, I spent so much of my own PTO talking about bad bills and seeing them just completely ignore, like, the 90% of the testimony is against, and completely ignoring it and passing it with no amendments. And I'm like, everyone that I talk to, I guess in my bubble, maybe it is super against this and doing everything they can, but it's hard to feel like we're making any kind of difference, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if you've got any ideas, I'm happy to hear them. That's all I want. It's like someone tell me, like someone tell me how to make our efforts meaningful and worth something, because that's really where we're struggling now. Is not that people don't care, is not that people don't want to be involved. It's just that no one flipping listens to us.
You know, I have to go back to the civil rights movement of the, the late 50s, early 60s. And, their struggle is your struggle, just in terms of no one was listening. No one cared, and the people who did care felt like they didn't have a voice. And the effort and the intention that they put into the organizing and the coalition building. And I think that that's a lesson for us, to revisit that, because and that urgency and that faith to endure, because I hear you and I feel you. It can be very overwhelming, and it can make you feel isolated, and it can cause exhaustion and depression. And that's why it's so important to build community, to make sure that you have other folks that you're working with, that you're growing with, that you can cry with, that you can laugh with. And I think, the civil rights movement is a great reminder of the type of preparation that is needed even during this time now. Yeah.
That is how I feel on my better days. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. And, I had a discussion with a friend this weekend, between, basically being like an activist and a queer educator and, environmentalist. I very much feel it's hard not to take things personal when you are very much, like enemy number one, as far as your state government is concerned, and personally targeted. But I said, at the very least, I'm exhausted, but I'm angry. And the worse that they treat us, and, the louder I'm going to get. And if I go down fighting, then I will march proudly into Valhalla. I'm not giving up. It just, you have your days where it is, where it really feels like, yeah, like I'm not going to lay down and take it, but I also don't think the efforts are going to get me anywhere. So at this point, it's really just so that I can say I did something. That is 100% how I feel some days.
A little plug for being involved internationally. Being an observer, being a physical observer, and being around these several tens of thousands of other observers is a really rich experience. But being an observer coming home and seeing the total lack of knowledge about what was going on, it can be really frustrating. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, I want to throw in a question at this point. And I realize we're about 4 minutes from the end, so this is a question to chew on rather than respond to, I guess. But one of the things that I really am eager to hear is in terms of organizing or encouraging the organization of hubs for remote engagement. What exactly do folks feel like the Clean Network could be doing to help this process? You say that may be something just to chew on, since we're at time pretty soon.
Yeah, and I might just kind of really appreciate Carolyn and Lynn, what you were sharing with each other, and just to sort of support structures in the model of the civil rights movement. And I feel like there's this converging of folks, and I think about the Climate Reality Project as one example. You've got, what are we at now? 40 or 50,000, 55,000, I think, trained leaders across the globe. And like Frank was saying, they were instrumental in having these side events happen in Glasgow and Edinburgh. is this huge pool of folks, and then take that and combine it with environmental justice and climate justice communities. And there's this emerging momentum and inertia that I'm excited about. And but still 100% hear you, Carolyn, that at the state level, when you're the target, you're getting roadblocked. It's not systemically changing in that state as quickly and as that we would want. But just know that there's this huge international community and growing kind of effort that I think is exciting. And that's where I gain some of my empowerment and my enthusiasm, because I get in that dark space too, where I feel overwhelmed and depressed by the rapidity that things are changing and the roadblocks. But I feel like these clean calls honestly have been a source of inspiration for me over the last couple of years, because I can reach across the Florida to you and hear your experience, and to Baltimore and to Colorado and to Portland. It's amazing, like to sort of hear that. So anyway, maybe we close it there, but and think about Frank's question, Katie and Gina, like, again, and I know there's a lot of efforts with Clean too that are happening to try and facilitate ongoing dialogue and ways to work together. So maybe that's something to revisit as well.
I actually wanted to say that next week, something similar had come up in past calls where we were talking about being an ambassador of sorts for the Clean Network, and how we work with outside groups and what that looks like. And I think that this could kind of tie into that discussion. I say next week because it's on the schedule we talked about next week. And that might actually be a good segue into next week, thinking about what exactly we're, kind of the identity of this community, and what we want to get out of it, what we want to, like, who do we say that we are, So, yeah, something good to mull over maybe over the next week. Yeah.
Well, thanks everyone for being here. Great to meet you, Katie and Lynn, I think for the first time. Look forward to future talks.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. I enjoyed the conversation today. Take care, everybody.
Thanks,
Good.
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Take care.